Welcome to our discussion today about maintaining in-person special education programming when schools close or retrench. This is a particularly timely and critical topic for families of children with disabilities. We've seen during the spring semester from the closing of schools of March through largely the present that children with disabilities have been the most impacted population by the lack of in-person instruction. At the time of the pandemic, it was understandable that all schools would close because all groupings of all kinds were to be eliminated and to be stopped, and full-time virtual instruction for all students was at least more understandable, even though the children with disabilities found themselves to be the most affected by that closing. Things are different now. And we're going to talk about how they're different, why they're practically different, legally different, functionally different, and how families can advocate for the in-person instruction that children with disabilities so desperately require in order to make meaningful educational progress. Now, we start with a few basic tenets as we're looking at this topic legally, factually, practically. First of all, every kid's individual. There may be some parents who, for any number of reasons, do not want in-person instruction. It could be due to health complications of the child. It could be who resides in the home with the child. So there can be any number of reasons why a parent might want virtual instruction, especially for children who are largely included. And that virtual instruction perhaps can be supplemented in a number of ways by additional tutoring, by parent training, by assistance from a number of professionals, even if virtually, as supplements in order to allow that child to make meaningful progress. But for those parents who have children who can only realistically make meaningful educational progress, who realistically can only move ahead academically, socially, behaviorally, physically through in-person instruction, the situation is so far different today, and effective advocacy, we believe, in many, if not most, cases can result in obtaining that kind of in-person instruction. So we look at each kid individually, we look at each family situation individually, we look at each school building individually and each school district individually, and to a certain extent, each state where they're having different considerations, different proposals, different paradigms. And I'm joined today by our supervising partner of special education, Michael Connolly, and another one of our very experienced and highly qualified special education attorneys, Kim Caputo, who have both worked in this field for decades and will have enormous insights beyond my introductory comments. And I welcome both of them today. I should have introduced myself. I'm Dennis McAndrews, and am looking forward to discussing this with all of you. Another important starting point in this process is that we must recognize that a child with disability continues to have the same right to a free, appropriate public education, as we call it FAPE, free, appropriate public education, with an appropriate IEP in the least restrictive environment, which means the maximum integration in the typical school process as possible. Now, those rights, even during the height of the lockdown in the spring of 2020, those rights were not waived, were not changed, were not altered by the federal government, by the state government, even though in the case of the federal government, Congress specifically invited the United States Department of Education to ask for waivers or changes in educational policies. And in a number of cases, outside of the realm of special education, the United States Department of Education actually instituted requests and policy changes for those waivers. The only thing that really changed in terms of the rights of students was a statement by both the federal and the state's Department of Education that while schools were closed to in-person instruction, school district evaluations did not have to occur. And that's an important factor. Ironically, there's some question as to whether that is even a binding statement on the part of those federal and state agencies, because there was no waiver asked of either the United States Congress or the Pennsylvania legislature to preclude evaluations from taking place. And any number of our private evaluators that we work with are now conducting in-person evaluations with appropriate medical and health precautions, masks and screens, ventilation, in some cases doing it in an outdoor setting. So, you know, they're undertaking evaluations while preserving the integrity of those evaluations. In addition to the child's right to a free, appropriate public education and least restrictive environment, pendency also remains in place. So the last IEP of the child is that which is in force for the upcoming school year. So if that called for in-person instruction, as virtually all IEPs would, that would be the pendant placement and the pendant mode of instruction for those children. If an IEP was altered during the pandemic to allow for virtual instruction, in most cases, those IEPs were supposed to be interim and temporary, and a parent could either reopen that IEP process or could point to the fact that if a school district is providing some in-person instruction, that child should receive in-person instruction. We see now schools are running the full gamut. The school year is approaching. Some are saying 100% virtual instruction. Some are saying 100% in-person instruction, although the latter is certainly the minority. And many are going to a hybrid approach where perhaps it's 2 days of in-person instruction and 2 days of virtual instruction, and then a day for children to work independently. Think of what that means when you have either all virtual instruction by a school district, or you have only 50% of the children or less in a school building at any one time. That frees up enormous amount of space for children with disabilities to have in-person instruction with proper physical distancing, and schools should be looking for heightened ventilation using open windows, exhaust fans, obviously masks and gloves. But the typical special education class has anywhere from 6 to 12 kids. So in a typical classroom, there should be plenty of space to have the physical distancing which has been recommended by the CDC and other health agencies. Moreover, with the schools either empty or largely empty, or only 50% filled, there will be more classroom space. There will be more opportunity to use large group rooms like cafeterias, like auditoriums, gymnasiums, where there can be a greater spread. And you know, obviously other protective devices such as face shields in some circumstances and gloves may be appropriate. But the point is that this situation where the schools are not as populated or are unpopulated now presents in a manner very distinct from the spring an opportunity for kids to receive in-person instruction using the guidelines of the federal and state health authorities, which we have been told over and over again are sufficient to allow in-person instruction to occur safely. And in fact, given the broader physical space, it's even more safe than what the guidelines have provided, which in some cases are as little as 3 feet distant. Special ed classes are smaller, there's more available space, there's more available rooms, and there's certainly an opportunity there to provide in-person instruction, even in interior spaces. And recognize that some schools are now using outdoor tents because the rate of transmission is 20 times less, according to the most recent studies. One school in Long Island has now rented 15 tents to provide outdoor instruction, where again, the rate of transmission is so low. So there's lots of things that we can do, lots of opportunities here that for parents to be able to advocate effectively for their children to obtain in-person instruction. So I've said some initial thoughts, and Mike, if I could turn it over to you for your thoughts.
Sure. So thanks, Dennis. And as Dennis mentioned, studies that are being done are showing that these pandemic related school closures have really had a negative impact on students' learning and most significantly on kids with special needs, particularly, seeing a lot of a real lack of progress in goals, objectives, a lack of even progress monitoring on those goals and objectives in that context, and really seeing regression for those students. So, what can't continue is what has occurred initially in this process with schools doing, when the pandemic first hit and we first had the school closures and they went virtual, and there was a mix of synchronous and asynchronous lessons and some assignments posted for students to do, maybe some virtual office hours. It didn't work, and there's no reason to think that all of a sudden, as we're looking at the fall and what are we going to do in the fall, that all of a sudden that is going to work. It's not. So we have to do something different. Schools have to be a little bit more creative in those answers. And Dennis, talked a little bit about some of this with schools making the decision to either go virtual or some sort of hybrid, really opening up space within the buildings, having a less population or nobody in there, so that they can do that social distancing effectively in those buildings, using those larger areas like cafeterias, auditoriums, gyms, those kinds of things.
And I think those are important considerations, Mike. And I know I touched on them, but I think many of them bear repeating, because these are issues that allow kids to get back to work. And so please feel free to reiterate if I jumped in too far.
Absolutely, and it's critical, and you are seeing some schools that are starting to kind of think in this way. I know there's at least one in the western part of the state, and I've heard some rumors about some others here in the eastern part of the state, where even though they are going virtual, even though as a general rule, or even though they're going to do some sort of hybrid, they're making an exception for students with special needs, students with IEPs, to do that 5-day instruction. And I think more school districts, or frankly all school districts, really need to do that. There is no school closure order from the governor as it stands, either in Pennsylvania or Delaware. And all indications, I think, from both governors, at least at this point, is that they aren't going to make that kind of an order, and they're going to let individual school districts decide exactly how to start the school year. So this really does become important. And again, the outside instruction, I know, eventually it's going to get too cold in Pennsylvania and Delaware, maybe, to do the outdoor, but using existing pavilions or other structures that they might have on their grounds, renting tents, getting fans or portable fans or heaters for the fall season as it's getting a little bit colder. Those are all options. And as Dennis said, some are doing that, but those are all options that are available to make it safer. The social distancing, teachers and students wearing face masks. Now, there's going to be a limited number of students that, because of their disability, aren't going to be able to wear face masks, or aren't going to be able to wear them for a significant amount of time. But there's other means to address that. There's face shields, which are less confining, less restrictive for students. There's plexiglass dividers that could be put up, in between desks or at tables for tabletop type activities that would provide that protection. In fact, we at our own office have plexiglass dividers in our conference room for when we need to meet with clients in person, to add that level of protection. Now, a lot of Dennis had mentioned the ventilation. A lot of new schools may have ventilation systems built in that will help. But for older buildings, it is as simple as really opening up the windows, using an exhaust fan, or even maybe a standing fan to help push the air out of the classroom. Another way to make things safer. Minimize the transition. If you're going to have kids that are going to be receiving services from different providers or different teachers, instead of having the kids traverse the halls in the school to get to the teacher or a related service provider, have that individual come to the student in the classroom. Keep the students together in a cohort so that they're not, that their contact with different students is limited to the day, to the cohort that they're spending the day with. Instead of going to the cafeteria for lunch, have the lunch brought to the classroom so the kids are eating in the classrooms. Schools might have to make some modifications to how lunch is served. Obviously, you don't want all the kids pulling from a shared serving utensil, or maybe you're individually doing the lunches and bringing them to the children. Staggering arrival times and departure times is another way to reduce or minimize the risk, so that you don't have everybody that's coming to school arriving at the same time and departing at the same time, and they're in the halls and the entryways at the same times. So those are all really key, important things for school districts to look at. And I think if school districts aren't open to looking at those options, and they're not willing to consider beyond, look outside of the box and go beyond what we were doing in March, I think they are really opening themselves up to liability and to the possibility for due process. As Dennis said, the requirements of the IDA are still in effect. The FAPE requirements are the same. The Congress and the Department of Education had the opportunity to decide whether they wanted to grant waivers or make modifications, and they chose not to. So the same standard that was in place prior to the pandemic for what constitutes FAPE for an individual student is the same standard that's in place today in the midst of the pandemic. And school districts really need to look at how they're going to address that, because I think that, we're now, I think students or school districts, and I think to some degree rightly so, got a bit of the benefit of the doubt when the pandemic initially hit. It came up all of a sudden. Nobody was really prepared for it. But now we've had months of learning more about the disease, but also learning more about ways to prevent its transmission and to handle instruction. So I think that school districts are really need to do more than what we did. And I don't think that benefit of the doubt is there. And I think due process hearings to force the issue are a possibility if school districts aren't willing to consider it as an IEP team and really think about how we're going to address students' needs. So, having a hearing, asking a hearing officer to order districts to do in-person instruction and to use some of these techniques, I think is a real consideration. I think there's the potential liability for compensatory education during this time where districts aren't willing to consider these kinds of solutions and safety precautions to allow for the in-person instruction for kids with special needs. And I think they're even opening themselves up to real potential liability for tuition reimbursement, particularly where you have a private school that a parent is looking at that is implementing the kinds of strategies and techniques we're talking about to make things safe, and are providing 5-day-a-week in-person instruction in comparison to a school district program that is all virtual. Maybe it's a combination of asynchronous and synchronous instruction, and it's kind of maybe a slightly better version of what happened in March. I think that's a real liability for a school district for potential tuition reimbursement in that kind of a situation. So I think all in all, what can't stand is a continuation of what we've had up to this point. We've got to think outside of the box. We have to look at alternatives to make sure that kids with special needs who really need in-person instruction to be able to make progress, to be able to retain the skills that they've learned, that we're doing things to allow that to happen.
Ironically, Mike, it almost sounds like what you're saying is we need to think outside of the box to get inside of the box that we should be in the first place.
Yes.
To get back to where we were and to get back to providing meaningful instruction to kids. And, you know, to your point of outdoor instruction, that there are precedents in pandemics in the past that was used. New York Times had an article about 2 weeks ago. It's available online with many pictures of students, even in somewhat cold weather, bundled up and getting outdoor instruction in tents, because a century ago, we knew that outdoor transmission is dramatically less. We now know just about how dramatically less. And as you say, with heaters, with fans, a lot of climate control can be undertaken. Will it be as comfortable? Probably not. But will instruction be occurring, and those connections that kid to teacher to other kids connections be integrated? Of course it will. And even the novelty for those kids could be an exciting venture.
When you think about a kid with behavioral needs or emotional needs, how, you know, in the confines of your home online, how do you how is a kid supposed to make the connections that they need to make in order to make progress in those areas when they really are, you know, isolated to a degree in that sense? So I think, you know, finding ways to provide that in-person instruction safely is really key.
And those kids that you're mentioning are often missing out on the benefit of a co-teacher or of an instructional aide who's able to redirect things as they come up. So there are so many benefits, and so many benefits to having the in-person instruction, and so many detriments to the facade for many of these kids, that virtual instruction is anything other than a placeholder. So we're looking, as you said, to think out of the box to make sure that we can get these kids in a position where they can learn. And last I read, there's plenty of tents available, mostly because weddings are being canceled. Weddings and parties. Probably almost every one of us and those that are listening to us today have had multiple events canceled that may have been under a tent. And, you know, most schools are not effectively looking in that direction, when it can certainly be available as something to utilize if they don't have other indoor alternatives that can be undertaken. So there's real opportunities here. We just have to have the will and the skill and the desire to move ahead with them. So Kim, can I turn it over to you for some additional thoughts?
Absolutely. And I want to echo what both of you have said. And I want to invite our listeners. First, I want to greet our listeners and extend good health to everyone who has tuned in. And I want to really empower, and I want to emphasize that word, empower, those of you who have tuned in who are parents, that you've got critical information. That information exists with you in terms of what you were able to observe about your child during that time period that Dennis and Mike talked about, that March 2020 till the end of the school year time, when some amount of virtual instruction was happening, as we've, as a firm, have been able to assess across the Commonwealth. That period of time forms the basis for certain conclusions that you have probably already been able to reach, that online instruction might not have been particularly successful for your child, that the level of face-to-face between your child and an actual teacher, synchronistic learning, was minimal, and perhaps to the extent it was provided, was not successful. That having to log in and do worksheets and work as parent to child in isolation from an educational program was not successful. Maybe your child, prior to the closure in March, received speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Maybe none of those things happened. Maybe some of those things happened, but in a very limited way. My point is, you have that information, and that information is data, and you should feel very powerful and empowered to use that data to advocate in the way that Mike and Dennis have talked about, which is continuing along this course is not successful for my child. And as Dennis and Mike said, there are a multitude of options. It only takes a moment for, and I know that parents of special needs children know how to do this, flexibility and creativity. You have spent your life in this way, and you bring that mindset to districts. And what we are finding is districts have kind of gotten lockstepped. We are seeing more and more and more districts put forth school opening plans for September, and they are kind of just retrenching into 100% virtual. And that is going to be a repeat, maybe with a few tweaks from what you saw March to June, but not anything significant. And we are here to talk to you about options. So for example, imagine your child, a child with an IEP. Maybe they are transported to a main school building by district transportation. Maybe you are able to transport them, but they are in an instructional setting. There will be combinations of children. To Mike's point, possibly smaller cohorts of children that would make it easier to maintain safety protocols, but a blend of children, children with IEPs as well as typical developing children. A teacher, a classroom assistant. Perhaps that is a teacher certified in the general ed curriculum with a special educator visiting different rooms to support the students with IEPs. The general education curriculum can be presented by the general ed teacher. Perhaps it can also be done with a camera or a computer, much like we're doing now, so that that lesson can also be piped over or delivered to those students who do need to remain at home for various health reasons. Once the lesson is concluded, for those students with IEPs, that's the perfect opportunity, of course, using social distancing and the other safety measures for that classroom assistant to work one-on-one, either with individual students or then perhaps in small group, to reinforce the lesson, to chunk the instruction, to give examples of the instruction that apply to actual real-world experiences, to use manipulatives. Of course, that would add an extra safety step because those manipulatives would have to be sanitized and cleaned. But frankly, early years educators are very used to doing that. There is not a kindergarten or a preschool teacher who is not very familiar with the work bin of materials that then has to get soaked at the end of every day to ensure that it is clean and safe for subsequent use. So that's an example of what could happen in a classroom that is not replicable online. And that is what kids with disabilities need, and that is what is lacking. So using your data from your experience from March to June about how your child responded, how was instruction delivered, bring that to the district with some of these ideas to advocate for something different as opposed to 100% virtual instruction. I also think it bears repeating because I find it incredibly mind-twisting, quite honestly, that when you look at the state of Pennsylvania, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and when you even take a bird's eye view into the place that I'm most familiar with, which is Philadelphia, you will find a variety of models within the same geographic boundary. So for example, Philadelphia School District initially was going to open with a hybrid model, some days live instruction, some days virtual. Ultimately, the board decided on 100% virtual for the entire first semester. Within the same geographic boundaries, the city of Philadelphia, there are examples of charter schools around the corner from Philadelphia Public Schools that are opening with far more live instruction. As Mike indicated, private schools specializing typically in delivering instruction for children with IEPs, we are aware of many of these private schools that are also taking steps to ensure that some amount of live instruction is being delivered. These are schools physically situated within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and oftentimes around the corner from public schools that have made opposite decisions insofar as instruction can only be provided 100% virtually. So I invite you to take a pause, to consider how has your child done? How has your child fared March to June? What have you learned from that experience? What can you bring to your district, to that conversation table about what wasn't successful and how you would like it to change? And I'll just close by bringing up one more point. I dare say that each and every one of you who is tuning in, who is a parent, worked very, very hard March to June, not only to manage your household, but to manage the world of work. And then all of a sudden, you were asked to manage education. You were asked to partner in education, something that I know you've done from the get-go, but now in a way, March to June, that was very, very different. Perhaps you were asked to basically be a speech therapist, be an occupational therapist, be a teaching assistant. We have heard through potential clients multiple stories of this high level of parent engagement actually in the instruction that was being required. Ask yourself, if this school year is opening with 100% virtual, what will you need? What training do you need to be that effective piece of the educational puzzle for your child? I'm not suggesting that that is an appropriate education. I think that that goes beyond typical parent engagement that serves as a piece of IDEA, but I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues think. I do think it goes above and beyond, but putting that as a baseline, if school is going to be 100% virtual, I think it is absolutely within your bounds as a parent to say, hold on, I need some training if my child's education is going to be rolled out in this manner, because it is not fair to the child and his or her progress, nor is it fair to the parent for them to have to adopt that highly involved connection to actual curriculum in the state of Pennsylvania. So we are here to help. I hope that some of the things that I've outlined and described are helpful to you. And I'd turn it back over to Mike or to Dennis.
I'll throw out a couple comments and then pass the floor to Mike. I have long felt that two of the poor stepchildren of special education are meaningful transition planning and parent training. Both of those are expressly required where necessary to provide appropriate education for children with disabilities. Transition planning is something we talk about frequently and about the importance of community-based instruction. I'll set that aside for right now because that's certainly one of the more difficult things to implement on a community integration basis of kids going and working in stores and that sort of thing, in businesses that their parents find. But that certainly should ramp up once this academic is over, and it should ramp up more intensively, because so often transition planning where kids who are not going to go to post-secondary education are being integrated into the workforce, that's where the rubber meets the road for those kids. And those kids are developing the skills in a good transition plan that allows them to be in competitive or at least partially competitive employment going forward, and allows them to have independence and self-sufficiency in the future. So when this pandemic is over, transition planning is something that really needs to be looked at, and it has to go well beyond wiping tables in the cafeteria, shredding documents, and delivering mail in the school. It has to be out in the community. It has to be meaningful. It has to be practical and work towards independence and self-sufficiency. But for right now, parent training has never been more important. I have reviewed in the course of my relatively long career thousands and thousands and thousands of IEPs. I would estimate that no more than 1% of those IEPs listed as a related service parent training. It is a related service under special ed law, no less than occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy. And now, where parents who are involved in virtual instruction, or from a practical perspective, have to have involvement in that virtual instruction, they should be receiving almost universally some form of parent training. It could be a group parent training, depending upon the needs of the child, or it may be an individual parent training. But the parent needs to be able to help that child access the instruction in the first place. And secondly, then how to re-instruct properly. Because the relationship between a parent and a child and a teacher and a child are very different. One of the great things about being a teacher is that oftentimes the kids listen more to the teacher because they listen to the parent all the time, and the parent just becomes kind of a talking head. So parents need to get tips on how best to guide their kids in a non-judgmental way, in a positive way, an effective way, so that they're not, again, just the talking head looking as though they're providing negative information. We all as parents can need help, guidance, reminders, insights. And that's hugely important now, and it really should be part of IEPs during this interim process. Mike, additional thoughts you might have?
I mean, I agree. I think, particularly parent training is one of the most, underutilized, and wrongly so, but one of the most underutilized related services, and has been, since I started practicing in this. I mean, it's never been something that's been in the forefront or something that I've seen used with any level of frequency. And I agree now it's probably one of the most important parent or related services for parents to have that training. Again, whether depending on the needs, it can be done in a group or it needs to be individual based on that specific child. It's key, and it was key in March. It's key now. I think more important, obviously, and has more of an impact for parents who are find themselves in a situation where it is primarily a virtual, like Kim had mentioned earlier. Not that putting that level of responsibility on the parent is necessarily appropriate, but even in cases where there's more in-person instruction, given the time the time that we're in right now with the pandemic and things are just they're different, and there's going to be more going on at home. I think that parent training is even more more critical than it's ever been.
And so a few additional thoughts and maybe some takeaways. Virtual instruction should not be the default button right now for kids with disabilities. The situation has changed from the spring. We have guidance from state and federal health authorities. We have no waivers of the right to a free appropriate public education or an appropriate IEP. Pendency remains in place so that the last permanent agreed upon IEP, which almost always calls for in-person instruction, is the starting point. And if parents of children with disabilities are told that, well, all instruction will be virtual, the next question is, how do we obtain and provide in-person instruction for my child consistent with the IEP? And so it's an opportunity for parents and people like us to advocate on behalf of those kids, because the school district has to have a better answer than we're just doing it all virtually, or kids are only coming 50% of the time. There has to be an answer as to why that can't happen for these kids with disabilities. And it's an opportunity for all of us to creatively look at the situation, remind those who would be resistant to the instruction of the rights of these children and the needs of these children. This is not just a question of standing on legal rights. It's a question of, we know how these children were the most impacted by this lockdown. And we now have the guidance of how to do it differently. Let's implement it. We've been asked by a number of individuals, how does the lockdown and what will occur in September if appropriate in-person instruction isn't occurring, how does it translate into compensatory education? And I think it is worthwhile to point out that both the federal and state governments have clearly stated an expectation that children with disabilities will often, if not most of the time, be entitled to some level of compensatory education due to the time that they haven't received in-person instruction, because we know that they tend to be impacted. And so Pennsylvania has actually put out guidelines on June 30 as to how what I will call lockdown compensatory education is to be identified and calculated, which is essentially trying to take baseline of where they were before this started, and then provide in-person instruction for 3 months to see how much they are able to recoup from where they were when the lockdown started, where they are at the time in-person instruction started, and where they get to once in-person instruction resumed. If they simply treaded water and only get back to the same spot, that's not meaningful progress, and there's going to be some compensatory education owed. If there are deficits, obviously there will be compensatory education owed. And that assessment, while similar, is nonetheless different from compensatory education that may be something that is owed for lack of appropriate programming even before the lockdown, when families come to us with their concerns. Generally, compensatory education is one of the things that we look to. And what that analysis involves is, what period of time did the child lack a fully appropriate IEP? What was the impact of that lack of a fully appropriate IEP? And then identify a number of hours of service that would be necessary to make that child whole, or to replace the instruction that either didn't occur or didn't occur appropriately. And we're generally able to negotiate a fund upon which the family can go and obtain privately purchased educational or therapeutic services to try to remedy that deficiency. And as Kim and Mike have both indicated, we are here to help. And we provide free consultations to families on all of these special education issues. The majority of our cases we're able to handle without families paying us a retainer or paying our hourly fees as we proceed, and we're able to recoup our payment at the end of the case when we've been successful in obtaining a resolution. So we're here to help. We're anxious to work with you. We hope that we've given all of you some tools that are going to assist in identifying means to obtain that appropriate, important, meaningful in-person instruction for the children that you love and for the children that we all serve. Kim or Mike, any final thoughts?
I'll just say I wish everyone a safe remainder of the summer. Know that we know you're doing your absolute best for your child. Please heed what Dennis said. You are not in this alone. You have information. You are able to move conversations forward. But you know what? We know that sometimes you just need to put your burden down for a little bit. And that is where we can come in. We are here to partner with you, to be your voice, and to help move things forward. I'll just add one little smidge of additional information for two particular groups of children. If you are listening and you have a child who is transitioning from what's called the early intervention programs into school age programs for September, this is going to be obviously a very, very different looking kindergarten year. You may want to consider reaching out to us so that we can look at your early intervention programming and how your child could transition perhaps more successfully in this very, very strange time. The other group of students that I would offer a similar, pause is for those students who you might be thinking are graduating this year in June of 2021, or maybe graduated, or you might not even be sure, in June of 2020. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. There are different timing requirements that may come into play that we would be able to help guide you through. I wish all of you a happy and safe summer. And again, know that we're here, and thanks for tuning in.
I would just echo both Dennis and Kim's comments. We're here to help, and it's something we all enjoy doing here. It's a nice area of the law, which is not always the case when you get into the practice of law. But when you're able to help kids like this, it really is. And you've got a group of attorneys and staff that are really dedicated to that here. So we're here to help. We're here to as Kim said, to be your voice when you need that assistance. And thanks for tuning in, and I wish everyone a safe and successful start to the new school year that's coming up.
Thanks so much, Mike and Kim. You're both great professionals, and it's such a pleasure to work with you. And we're, to piggyback on what Kim said, we can even obtain compensatory education that lasts after graduation at times. And so kids who found themselves in that quandary of either graduating last year or hoping to graduate this year, we can still help. And there's a myriad of ways that we can be of assistance. And we look forward to working with those of you who need our help. And we hope we've given you some important ideas to move the ball forward for your children. Thanks very much.